All right. Hey, everybody. So we are going to be looking at basically the final topic for our early civilizations course. The final real topic. I have a little bit of an epilogue coming next time, but this is sort of the last new material because we've been looking at how civilizations changed. We've been looking at sort of the time period of the European Middle Ages. And now we're looking at what was going on in the rest of the world during that time period. Because roughly where our class ends is like around the year 1000, but some of this stuff we only know from documents much later. So it's kind of approximately that. After the Middle Ages in Europe, that's when the world's really going to start changing. Europe's going to try and start conquering and trading and things like that. And we're going to enter something much closer to what we think of as modern society, the Renaissance and whatnot. And a lot of this is going to shift, and a lot of what we're looking at today is going to disappear after that time period, after 1492, after that whole rough time period. But I think it's important to remember that while the Northern Europeans were having their Middle Ages, a lot was going on in the rest of the world. And we looked at China last time, but we're finally entering a period where other cultures in Asia sort of start to show up on the map a little bit more. I mean, we've had India before, but India's kind of in a weird spot. Today we're going to look at cultures like Korea and Japan. We're also going to be able to talk about what we know about Africa. And then finally, we'll get back to the Americas to talk about the empires that were going on there. After such a long time, we had some evidence from very much the dawn of civilizations in the Americas. But we don't have as much reliable information until we get to, relatively late in the course of this class. So lots of interesting stuff to talk about. And those are our three big topics, basically: Asia, Africa, and the Americas. And then next time will be review. So without any further ado, let's just jump right into talking about other cultures in Asia. There we go, it's loaded. So what are we looking at here? Here's China. This is sort of the rough area of China. This is China today, but it's sort of roughly what we've been looking at, but also including Tibet, which we only went into a little bit in the context of Buddhism. But this is China, what China looks like today. But if we look at this map, we can see other parts of the world that are going to be influenced by China. Places like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Japan and Korea especially are going to be super influenced by China. It seems like culture travels across that way quite often. Oh, we've got Vietnam. But yeah, let's start off by talking about Japan. All these cultures are kind of influenced by China in terms of adopting a lot of the culture and ideas of China in the same way that a lot of cultures adopt things from Greece and Rome. And a big part for Japan is the writing system. So Japanese is actually completely separate language from Chinese, or like extremely separate, a whole different family of languages. But they ended up using the Chinese writing system approximately to write down their language. So there's some connections to Chinese culture, even though the languages are quite different. And that's going to kind of go show how it ends up being different from China. Okay, so an important thing to talk about when we talk about Japan is Shinto. So Shinto is kind of its own religion, and it's kind of a folk religion. It's kind of a classic tradition of worshiping the gods. And one way to translate Shinto might be the way of the gods. But it's still very much practiced today and a big part of Japanese life and culture. I guess it's kind of like Hinduism in being tied to sort of local culture and specifically, the culture of a particular region. While having a lot of diversity and a lot of different gods being involved. So Shinto is basically the worship of what are called the kami, and kami is a difficult word to translate. It can be translated as gods, but it can also be translated as something like nature spirits. The concept is sort of in between. There's a lot of feeling of these kami, these gods, dwelling in a particular place. The god of a particular river, the god of a particular stream or forest or something like that, which is maybe something that we're starting to become a little bit more familiar with now that Japanese culture is kind of connecting to American culture a little bit more. But yeah, there's a sort of whole tradition of the way of the gods, and these Japanese temples with this distinctive sort of almost like letter T shape. It tends to be a very distinctive Japanese style. Um, that's kind of connected to the tradition of worshiping these gods. So at these shrines, people do a lot of local traditions that have been practiced for hundreds of years of worshiping these gods. There are also gods that are famous in sort of a larger sense throughout the Japanese mythology. Like there's a story of the first man and the first woman, these gods who sort of churned the islands of Japan into being, and then later their children were the sun, the moon, and the storm god, and then the sun goddess became the ancestor of the Japanese emperor. So there's a lot of cultural connections to a lot of traditional legends here. But at the same time, there's also a very local thing of, taking care of the shrine for your particular god and worshiping your particular spirits. And so you don't necessarily have to join any particular belief system. You can partake in the rituals and give food and give worship to the particular local god or local spirit. These distinctive gates are called the torii gates and are a very common symbol of Shinto because they usually represent the entrance to something sacred. Now, when Buddhism comes over into Japan, a lot of these gods become connected to the bodhisattvas, as they did in China. And that's where Buddhism comes from, is China, as well as Confucianism and whatnot. And Taoism comes over from China. But Buddhism and Shinto seem to have a lot of similarities in terms of the way that there are monasteries and the way that you sort of take care of particular spirits and have holy relics and things like that. This is very easily connected to the tradition of the bodhisattvas. And like Buddhism, in addition to any sort of religious worship component, Shinto also really emphasizes taking care of other people and being a good and kind person. You take care of the spirits, you take care of each other. So Shinto is still a pretty significant religion today. And today, Japan is a little bit more agnostic, but there's still a lot of classic traditions of this way of the gods. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more of the culture of Japan. There are basically two periods of Japanese culture I want to talk about. One is the Heian period. So the Heian period is the first time period where you really have a Japanese emperor. And basically, the imperial court rules from a town called Heian, which is today known as Kyoto. And there's a lot of nobles and a lot of wealthy people composing poetry, experiencing a lot of Chinese influences in terms of Buddhism, Taoism, I spelled it with a D again, and Confucianism. All these things are coming in from China, and originally the Heian period kind of starts off as directly ruled by China, and then it kind of breaks away. And all these nobles are trying to show that they're great poets, they're great writers, they're great artists, they're making beautiful paintings. It's a lot of the same things that we saw in Chinese culture in terms of using literature and art to make yourself seem like a very classy and a noble type of person. And so there's a lot of mansions like this where the nobles meet and where they communicate about all these things. And even though theoretically there's an emperor, it's really the nobles who have more power than that. The Fujiwara clan, especially. And we have some great literature from this time period, including The Tale of Genji, which is kind of one of the first novels, and maybe the first novel that really delves deep into the psychology of its main character. And this is written by a lady named Lady Murasaki, who writes in addition to the story of Genji, she writes about her own life, and so gives us a real insight into what it was like during that time period and what that sort of court noble life was like, if you ever want to read her own diaries. And she's a good example of how the literary scene was working. It's interesting. In China, we had a lot of women writers, and they were considered part of the mainstream literary culture. In Japan, it's a bit different. In Japan, women are not supposed to be writers in Chinese. So Chinese is originally where it's at, That's the cool language. That's where, all the high class culture is. But over time, women's voices start to become more valued because women are writing in Japanese. They're writing in a much more local culture, whereas the men think they're so special for doing Chinese culture. The women over time, Japanese culture, literature, Japanese language literature starts to become more respected. And so then these works of art become more valued. And like I said, Japanese uses Chinese's writing system in a sort of complicated roundabout way, which we don't have to get into here, but is originally based on Chinese writing, but is a different set of vocabulary and whatnot. But yeah, that's the Heian period. And then after that, we have the shogunate. So the shogunate is the mainly there's a couple of shogunates, but the one we're looking at is the Kamakura shogunate, which is from the 1100s to the 1300s. So pretty late from what we're looking at in our period, but I think it's worth mentioning. What is a shogun? The shogun is like a military dictator. He's like a general. And this is a time period basically when the army takes over Japan. There's an emperor, and theoretically the emperor is supposed to have power, but you know who's really in charge? It's the shogun, this general. And the general is kind of controlling the emperor. The emperor is kind of his puppet. And usually the shogun comes from a powerful family, and it's almost like feudalism in Europe. The shogun has land, and then he hands out this land to these warriors who work for him. And who are these warriors? Well, instead of knights, Japan has samurai, but they serve a very similar purpose. They have like a code of honor, and they travel around a lot. Sometimes they lend their services to various people when they don't have land, or they fight so that they can hope to get land later from the shogun. And so these samurai, they're constantly fighting to ensure their place in society. But they also develop kind of a code of honor, Bushido, to ensure that they fight in a respectful way. And, they have a certain nobility to them. They take pride in being these kind of almost noble knight type of figures in their armor and whatnot. And the reason they do this is because, they're working for the shogun. And then once they have land, they have it be worked by peasants. So it's very similar to the feudalism that we saw in Europe. And then later on, you have another shogunate where the samurai actually have guns, but that's outside of our time period. But the thing to remember about a shogun is that he's not the emperor, and he's not a samurai himself. He's the general of the samurai, but he controls both. He controls the emperor and he controls the samurai. And there's a lot of sort of cultural clashes during this shogunate. The things are not politically unified. But yeah, the time of the samurai is a remembered period as being this sort of noble time period in Japanese history, whether we think that's true or not. Okay. The samurai have this wonderful moment of victory against these outsiders and invaders, Mongols. The Mongols, we're going to touch on them next time. They take over China and bring an end to that time period of Chinese history. But they don't manage to take over Japan because the wind blows their ships away. And that wind is known as the divine wind, the kamikaze. And later on, the fighter pilots in World War II named themselves after the divine wind, the kamikaze. Okay, just want to touch real briefly on some other cultural sphere of Eastern Asia. We've got Korea, which is named after sort of a kingdom that took over the others. There were 3 kingdoms in that region, and Goryeo was the most successful. They're very notable for having some very good documents in terms of Buddhism, the classic Buddhist texts. They have some of the best versions of it. Interestingly, they had government-run Buddhism, but also Confucianism, which they picked up from China. And they are ultimately conquered by the Mongols. And then for a while after that, they're ruled by China until relatively recent times. And then we also have Vietnam, which is notable for a rebellion led by these peasant sisters, the Trung sisters, Trung Trác and Trung Ni, and they rise up against Han China. And these sisters are still really remembered in Vietnamese history as a symbol of Vietnamese identity. And they actually fend off the Mongols, not the sisters themselves, but later descendants of them. And they stay independent until the Vietnamese War, basically, that we are familiar with. So that's pretty wild. Okay, that's Asia for you. We'll go and move on to Africa.